Welcome to 5 Minutes with Jesus. I am hoping one day to have enough of these things to have 365 of them so they could be used as a daily devotional throughout the year. But on the other hand, I'm wondering if that is a bad idea. Not to do a ton of these things, but to present it like a yearly commitment. When it comes to New Year's resolutions, for me, I'm exceedingly excited on January 1st. On January 2nd, I'm about half as excited as I was. And by January 3rd, the only thing motivating me is guilt, which I think is a common phenomenon, which is why very few people actually stick with their New Year's resolutions past February. So here's the thing. For years and years growing up, I always believed that guilt was a function of grace, that the grace of God used guilt like a tool, maybe like a cattle prod or something, to get people to do what they're supposed to do, or to stop you from doing the things you're not supposed to do. Folks, that is not true. That is not even close to true. This is what David says in his prayer in Psalm 32. He is praying about God's forgiveness. I'm not sure what had happened in his life, but this prayer is all about the forgiveness of God. And in verse 5, he says, I acknowledged my sin to you, and my iniquity I did not hide. I said, I will confess my transgressions to the Lord, and you forgave the guilt of my sin. When Jesus died on the cross, our sin got nailed to the cross with him, buried in the tomb with him, and he rose from the dead without it leaving it behind, and it does not stick to us anymore. He did the exact same thing with our guilt. He took our sin to the cross, and he took our guilt to the cross. So folks, let me ask you this. If guilt was nailed to the cross, buried in Jesus' tomb, and left behind, then why are we still listening to his voice? Guilt is not a function of grace. Guilt is not a tool of grace. Guilt is not used by God in conjunction with grace, folks. Guilt is the enemy to grace, and you can only listen to one of them. If you are listening to the voice of guilt, you are not listening to the voice of grace. If guilt is your master, grace is silent and gone, and you can't hear it anymore. But the good news is, every time you say yes to grace, it crowds out the voice of guilt a little more. I had listened to guilt for so long in my life that I couldn't even recognize Grace's voice anymore. So what I did was I started listening to guilt. Okay, this is what guilt tells me to do. And then I do the opposite, because every time I say no to guilt, it's a yes to grace, whether I can hear Grace's voice or not, because that is freedom from guilt. And freedom is where the Spirit of the Lord is. Galatians 5:1 says, it was for freedom that Christ set us free. Therefore, keep standing firm and do not be subject again to a yoke of slavery. Keep standing firm, folks. Do not go back under a yoke of slavery. Live in freedom, because that is grace. So I would suggest to you, when it comes to New Year's resolutions or any opportunity you have to serve God or to do a good thing or to do whatever, if it requires any sort of ongoing commitment, ask yourself this question. Does this add guilt to my life, or does this add grace to my life? And if the answer is guilt, your answer is no. But if this, 5 minutes with Jesus, adds grace to your life, more power to you. That is my prayer for January 1st, January 2nd, February 12th, and every other day of the year. For this year and every year for you. Dear Jesus, I pray that grace would become so loud and insistent that we can't even hear guilt anymore, that freedom would be our way of life, that we would walk honoring you because it is our delight, not because it is any sort of obligation. I pray that we would say no to guilt as many times as it takes to rob guilt of its power in our life, so that that power can go to you and the grace that sets us free. In your name I pray, amen.